My name is Brandon Muller, and I'm a sound designer. The intent of the following video is to convey my ability to think critically as a sound designer for games by taking an existing game and changing it for the better. I will also be touching upon how certain sound design choices impact how players receive information from the game, how this can either make or break a gaming experience, and how I implemented these concepts into this project. Please note that this is not necessarily a video focusing on my ability to design sounds themselves for an experience. If you wish to see something along those lines, please check out this other video I made where I stripped out all the audio for a trailer for the game Death Stranding and built it back from the ground up. Some of my favorite games growing up were Twitch and arena shooters. Counter-Strike, Halo, Gears of War, Call of Duty. These games all have one thing in common. They all have extremely informative sound design. Sounds such as a plasma grenade in Halo and the charging up and firing of a torque bow bolt in Gears of War all tend to stand out when you play these games. And this design choice is no small detail. Each of these cues feed the player information by allowing the player to easily recognize immediate, life-threatening danger and, if they're quick enough, react to it, leading to a more visceral and rewarding multiplayer gaming experience. If these small design choices had been neglected in some way in these games, instead of enjoyment, the mainstream reaction to these games may have been more like this. It may seem like a small nitpicky thing, but often overlooked details like this can entirely change the dynamics of gameplay, and thereby impact the success of a title. Players don't like to feel like a death or failure in a game came out of nowhere, and sound design is a good way to stay on the correct side of this rather blurry line. This small detail is something that I feel has been either missing or given less importance in recent game releases. To illustrate my point, I'm going to play audio from 3 different recent multiplayer games. A quick disclaimer, though I will be critiquing these games on the way they're mixed, I want to point out that I think all 3 of these examples are fantastic video games in their own right for many reasons. Listen closely and try to determine not only which game each one is, but what is going on in each example. Were you able to guess? It's a bit difficult to place the first 2 because they sound very similar to many different recent games. It's kind of difficult to tell what's going on in the first example, which was Doom 2016 by the way, because even though the sound design itself is pretty unique and the creepy, hellish atmosphere is great and all, the way the sound is mixed has everything kind of blending together. You can't really tell who's shooting at who or even really where it's happening in the stereo space. The second bit of audio is from Titanfall 2, and though this game does do a better job achieving healthy dynamic range than Doom did, a lot of the sound cues don't really stick out in the mix that much by sounding different from one another. Guns all kind of sound the same, and even though they are loud enough in the mix to trigger an immediate response from the player, it's difficult to tell exactly which weapons are the ones that will one-shot you versus the ones that will slowly chip away at your player health if you stand in the line of fire for too long. In other words, it makes prioritizing danger difficult for the player. The final example, as I'm sure you figured out by now, is Overwatch. It was probably pretty easy to figure this out, since the sounds used in the game are all pretty unique not only from each other, but to the game itself. All the sounds are mixed pretty well, and it's easy to tell where everything is in relation to the player. Things like enemy weapons and ultimates are really easy to pinpoint in the mix. Why is this? This is the question I asked myself when beginning this project. I wanted to see if I could figure out how to apply this concept to an existing game and improve it by making existing sounds stand out as well as substituting weaker sounds for better ones. To start, I went to the Unreal Asset Store and found a multiplayer shooter project made by the Epic Games dev team entitled Shooter Game, which is free to download on the Learn tab on the Epic Games launcher. Upon launching the game, I came upon several things that could be changed about the sound design. See if you can spot them. Did you hear any? This game already sounds pretty good, and the Epic Games team have done a great job here, but everything seems to blend together. If I were in a 12-player match on this map, I doubt I'd be able to hear enemy gunshots and other audio cues that would assist me in avoiding danger and help me win the match. How do we combat this? To answer this question, let's turn back to Blizzard Games' Overwatch. In a GDC video released in April of 2016, sound designers at Blizzard decided to tackle this issue in a particularly unique way. They wanted to achieve a very difficult goal, to be able to theoretically play the game with the screen turned off, using only sound to guide the player. In order to do this, they created a system of buckets and audio kinetic Ys based on threat level. Each bucket has various gain controls, filters, and other effects applied to them that are triggered by game code so that no matter what situation the player is in, the most dangerous sound from the player's perspective is always the loudest.
And we figured out that if we have 5 really critical, important people all aiming and damaging you, again, we got drowned in the mix. So what we do instead is we came up with this idea of buckets, where we said, there's always one person we treat as the most important one. We put 2 in a medium bucket, and then we have like other buckets that Scott will talk about. And instead of actually giving the threat number to Wise, we will provide, and Wise actually, we could have mentioned that, is our middle software that we're using for the game designers of you. And then we give the bucket index to Wise, and then Scott can talk about how he reacts on those values.
So the way the buckets are broken down is that, like I said, there's one person in the high bucket. We normally have about 2 in the, and then we actually kind of change these numbers all the time based on, adjustments. But we have 2 in the normal bucket. In the low bucket, we have most of the enemies, as well as your friendly characters fall into that bucket. And then anything that kind of spills out past that goes into what we call the coal bucket, which isn't truly a coal, but it's like very, very low priority sounds, in our opinion, or at least that person is a very low priority.
This is a fantastic way to feed information to the player, and is superior to the existing standard of high dynamic range mixing where the loudest sound wins. Using this system, we can create a hierarchy of which sound should be the loudest and which should be quietest or get ducked when others are playing. We could similarly use Wise and its native integration into the Unreal Engine to do this, but since we already have all the sound infrastructure for the game built in the engine already, we can just edit these sounds utilizing the project's pre-built sound buses. The absolute first thing that we need to do if we're making any changes to the project is to sort our sounds into buckets based on the importance of the information they will convey to the player. Since we're not using Wise here, we can't necessarily go about this in the same way that Blizzard did when they were structuring their gain and filter hierarchy. We don't have specific code to call for different characters, as there is only one character model in the demo game we are working with. Therefore, we must instead use a hybrid of both their system and classic HDR, utilizing specific gain staging for each bucket level of the hierarchy, as well as ducking on the lower levels of the hierarchy to achieve HDR. In order to do this, we must first determine what sounds are most important to the player. It's pretty obvious that sounds that directly threaten the player character's life should be the loudest, and the most damaging weapon in the game is the grenade launcher, followed by the assault rifle. In the next bucket down, we should level our UI and player status sounds similarly, as during a firefight, it's important that the player knows if they or an enemy have just reloaded, picked up a health pack, etc. The next few buckets are a bit trickier than the ones above, however. These sounds include our music and ambient sound, as well as danger indicators such as player footsteps and jumping sounds. Since they have to both be leveled similarly, but we need to hear the footsteps when they're triggered over the music and ambient sound, we must modify our ducking so that HDR is respected here. In the final bucket goes our polish sounds that exist to flesh out the game a little bit, such as heavy breathing for running animations, armor moving around while walking, etc. These small details may seem trivial, but as Steve Swink states in his book Game Feel, polish is important. It's not good enough to just have good mechanical and environmental simulation in the game alone, though these are important concepts as well that should never be ignored. If all polish were removed, the essential functionality of the game would be unaltered, but the player would find the experience less perceptually convincing and therefore less appealing. This is because, for players, simulation and polish are indistinguishable. So now that we've made clear exactly what we need to do in regards to leveling, let's enact some of those changes. In order to properly level everything else, we need to start by maximizing our initial dynamic range. This means that the absolute first thing that needs to be changed about this project is the levels of the ambient noise and music. Though I do like them and don't necessarily want to change the actual design of these sounds, they're currently too loud and stand to obscure important audio information from the player. However, we still need to mix these ambient tracks lower but not have them drowned out by main sounds to retain that polished and visceral atmosphere they have been designed to create. We can do this by going to our master node hierarchy in our sound classes and mixes folder and reducing the music and ambient volumes on our output's volume multiplier to 43% and 45% respectively. Now that we have our dynamics cleaned up, it's time to begin properly leveling our sound buckets in order. Let's begin with our grenade launcher. Since being hit with this is the most dangerous thing that can happen to the player, we want this sound to be the loudest sound the player may hear at any one time, but not so loud that it drowns out other cues. In order to achieve this, we can modify the grenade launcher shot cue down to around 90% versus the 140% it was originally at. The other two cues, which are the sounds of the grenade flying through the air and the grenade exploding, are already at good levels and don't really need to be touched. In the second bucket down, we have our assault rifle. This sound is already at a nice enough volume to give players information, but just because I'm a perfectionist, I'm going to reduce the volume by 2% so that it sits in the mix a little nicer. The next major bucket that we need to level is our UI status sounds, which includes all ammo and health pickups. Since we have modulator nodes randomizing the gain of these within a set range, we won't be able to hear these cues at the exact same volume every time. In addition, the ammo and health cues each take up a differing part of the frequency spectrum, and therefore must not be leveled according to their actual decibel loudness but their perceived loudness. This has to do with a mathematical principle that most, if not all, experienced audio engineers are familiar with called the Fletcher-Munson curve. I won't go into great detail about it here, but the short explanation behind it is that humans evolved to hear different frequencies more prominently than others at different volumes, and this is mainly what contributes to making EQing and sound design so important. With these principles in mind, we can level our ammo and health pickup cues to around 42 and 46% respectively so that they can be heard over much of the chaos happening on screen but not take center stage. Next comes the trickiest bucket of the bunch, that being the one containing our footsteps, ambiances, and music. The major problem here is that the footstep samples that come with this game demo don't really stick out in the mix all that much, and in my opinion don't really fit the character model regardless. It's especially important that these samples stand out, as players need to know when an enemy is nearby. This is highlighted by Blizzard in that same video we saw before from GDC.
Actually, before I go any further, I want to point out one thing. The red outline is the high importance, the yellow is the next bucket down. And you'll see it swap back and forth, and listen to for their footsteps and how those things are really standing out when they're in the red high importance bucket.
I do still think that the rubbery sound of the footstep samples have value, but we're just not getting the punch of the character's jackboots that we need from the samples we have. So I created a new library of footsteps by combining the old samples we just heard with a few samples of boots running on concrete. To do this, I went into Ableton Live and created a bus with two sub-channels, one for the original footsteps and the other for the new ones. On the channel with the new footsteps, I added a bit of simple stereo delay to widen the sounds a bit and make them feel a bit more alive before taking a bit out of the mid-range and finishing things off with some multiband compression. For anybody curious, the multiband compression preset that I'm using here is modeled after Steve Dudah's popular OTT compressor, which is free for download on the X4 Records website. Next, I layered the original samples on the second channel while utilizing a transient designer to take out a little bit of the attack and sustain of the sample until I had it where I wanted it. Finally, to combine the two libraries together, I used another parametric EQ to boost the low end a little bit to get that punch we want to hear, as well as a bus compressor to glue everything together. The final product sounds like this. All we really have to do here is replace the old samples with the new ones by importing them and linking them to our pitch, gain, and sample randomizers, as well as re-leveling our output node so they're at the proper levels. The final issue to address in this bucket is how we are going to control dynamics for our ambient noise and our music. The project itself already has some ducking applied to these channels, however I feel as if the original settings aren't allowing other elements to shine as much as they should. To remedy this, I played around with the fade in and out settings a bit, which for all intents and purposes here are similar to traditional attack and decay settings, and ultimately landed on a fade in and out time of 0.2 seconds each. These settings make the game sound a lot tighter as a result, and allows all the gain staging we've done so far to shine through without strangling our ambience and music buses. The final bucket we've created deals with our polished sounds. These sounds kinda exist in the background, but are still important to the gameplay as they help to flesh out the world and give a better sense of engagement for the player. The first sound in this bucket is our player breathing sounds. This sound plays while running, and while we still need to be able to hear this sound, it should be leveled under everything else since it conveys non-essential audio information that is better conveyed by the player's footsteps. Consequently, we can level our volume multiplier on this cue to around 14%. The second sound cue in this bucket is a little bit trickier, however. After taking a look at the character models and hearing the design of the established jumping sound cues, I decided that since our player character is running around in a clunky exosuit, consequently we should hear some of that armor jingling around as we run. To set this cue, we can go into our animation subfolder and find the animation that we wish to modify. In this first example, this animation is our first-person perspective roadie run. If we play the animation, the sound cues play out as one might expect them to. This sounds alright, but as stated before, we want to hear some of our armor clinking around along with our footsteps. To do this, we can create a second notify track above our first one for our new sound. For consistency's sake, we will utilize one of our pre-existing sound cue files for the armor movement mixed at a low volume, similarly to our breathing sound cue. In this case, our body move stereo cue. Once we've staggered them from the footstep cues a bit to simulate realistic movement, we can play our animation again to test out our new sound. This slight tweak lends to a much better sounding run cycle. This process can be replicated for our other 3 walk and run cycles, with minor changes to our cue volume multiplier to differentiate quieter walking and louder running cycles from each other. Now that all our changes have been made, it's time to hear the final product. I'm going to play the 2 versions side by side and perform the same actions in each to give you a taste of how the 2 mixes differ dynamically. We can now see that the mix in our edited version of the project is much cleaner and allows the player a better sense of the environment and action around them. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked the video, please make sure to visit my website. The link is in the description, along with the link to all the other videos mentioned in this one. See you all next time!